new tactical manual for spiritual warfare. If you're a student, then I'm providing this for you to watch to prepare for the first session. If you're watching this out of your own curiosity and interest in this course, then you'll be able to register as a student or audit the course, and we'll provide that information. Recently, Ruth Ann and I were in an area of the country, and it was marked by a distinct spiritual pattern. I'm talking about a spiritual condition in the arena of spirit over this area, this region. I would include in the region not only the city or the town, but the area around it. And I would not define that area by a county or by man-made divisions on a map. In other words, the spiritual condition would define the arena of spirit as among the distinctives of that prevailing spiritual condition that were evident to us in the spirit. I heard God say the words sexual unrest. And I was then ministering there in a ministry, a kingdom ministry. And after sharing therein as a part of my message, more specifically, how this prevailing spiritual condition would manifest, having discerned it, having had a revelation of God saying a word of knowledge or wisdom, sexual unrest, that those two words began to unpack, and as well, there would be a manifestation or application of those spiritual conditions as they manifested in individual behaviors. Either, in this sense, sexual unrest, we would find victims of that influence, and it's a demonic influence, a cosmic order, or a cosmic dominator influence. In other words, you would find that a ruler or authority or a cosmic dominator, as Paul describes them in Ephesians chapter 6, had influence upon the people of that region inside this spiritual arena. And then that manifestation of sexual unrest would have several demonstrations of behavior or pathologies, as we would say psychologically, psychology being what people do and why they do it. Then we would see behaviors and relationships with sexual influence or sexual motivations. And so standing there with a microphone, number one, I used the weapons that are mighty through God to destroy the fortress built to protect embedded lies in individuals. Now, this is individual ministry. Weapons are mighty through God. Paul says to a group, I'm going to bring each of your spiritual mind, I'm going to bring your thinking into your thoughts, into obedience to Christ, instead of this obedience to something else. And then he describes that something else as something that's been embedded or rooted in the soul, planted there by the enemy, and then the enemy would build a fortress around it to protect what he'd embedded in order to maintain its influence upon the individual people. Now, you could pray that over a group, but the application would be individual. And Paul says, I have these weapons, and I'm not saying only apostles have them, but I functioned in apostolic authority, international in its scope, given to me by God, and in that authority, I tore down the fortresses and I exposed the embedded lies in the spirit in people who were in the room. Secondly, I prophesied God's intended purposes into the region. Thirdly, I announced with apostolic authority how God's intended purposes affected the region spiritually, and how God's intended purposes, helped to define the priorities of kingdom culture, the priorities of kingdom ministry. In that kingdom ministry in that region then would take on the priorities of God's intended purposes. Number 4, then I identified how this demonic intrusion, it has strategically limited God's intended purposes for the area. We call that a curse. Curse meaning limitation, blessing meaning expansion. And so, in other words, God intended this. The enemy then came to limit that, which is, one of the most basic aspects of spiritual warfare. And number 5, I prayed for people in the room who still suffered from wounds, traumas, and deceptions, because this prevailing spiritual condition had affected their lives. Or they came to the region with traumas, wounds, and deceptions, and this spiritual condition then added to or utilized those wounds. So I was applying spiritual warfare tactics from the new era of kingdom culture. And I used kingdom authority that's available through apostolic order. And I used it, applied it, demonstrated it to the region, this area, as I have done in more than 30 nations in the earth. I released the apostolic authority available, as Paul said, as weapons mighty through God, to individuals as well as into the spiritual arena itself, as Ephesians 3:10. And so I addressed the spiritual condition, or what Paul would say these authorities, rulers, and cosmic dominators produce. They produce this present darkness. They're bound in chains of darkness. That is to say, they live in darkness. Darkness is their environmental dominion, and wherever they are, they produce darkness that is present, functional in a spiritual arena, and this is what we wrestle to remove. We usurp the usurpers. Now, I'm giving an example of a mixture here. For many of you, would say a mixture of what we call the classic spiritual warfare techniques or methodologies, which we learned 70s, 80s, 90s. They've always been available, of course, and they're very biblical from the very beginnings of creation itself. In the garden, there was spiritual warfare because there was a serpent that Satan used through which to communicate. And so in the battle, of course, goes even before that because there was war in the heavenlies. But the spiritual warfare, which is a part of creation history, was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the early parts of this millennium, classically reintroduced during the apostolic restoration. Now that we've come into the Reformation, after decades of restoration, we are entering a new era, or we're entering decades of reformation. And as it took decades for the restoration to be completed, things lost, things started with apostles and then they faded out. They faded back in, so to speak, gradually were restored until the apostolic was finally fully available, and it is. So now this Reformation goes deep into the substrata of God's kingdom on earth. And the Reformation runs smack dab into the existing and prevailing spiritual conditions. Now, they've always been there, but because of this full restoration, we are beginning to discern and discover God's intended purposes for people and places. And as we press for that, we run right into the usurpers, the prevailing spiritual conditions, But we run into them now in this restored authority with such immediate force that a battle ensues between those representing Jesus and the enemies of Jesus. And this is extremely powerful confrontation, because it's for all the marbles. It's for all that darkness seeks to diminish and destroy of the eternal purposes of God. Now, it's the enemies of Jesus. We love our enemies when we defeat God's enemies. We bless our enemies, but we curse God's enemies. That is, we expand our enemies. We seek good to those who do us badly or poorly, do evil against us, even persecute us. But we curse God's enemies, limiting them. We love our enemies, and I'm talking about our personal enemies. Nothing generalized there. We love our enemies while opposing the spiritual influence operating in and through those enemies if they, as Simon Peter did Jesus, if they contradict God's will and purpose for us. As Simon said, no, you're not going to you're not going to suffer at the hands of the Jerusalem political elite and then be killed, Jesus. That's not going to happen. And Jesus said, get behind me, Satan, in all love, because there was no hatred in Jesus' words. We hate God's enemies as God hates them. That's, of course, what the Bible says. And so that's the reality. Fighting all they do to limit, frustrate, and diminish God's intentions for people and places. And so, I'm not in love with the devil, and I don't bless him. I don't pray for his salvation, because he doesn't have any coming. There is no restoration of Satan. There is an eternal destruction, which is going to hit him in an eternal way when all evil and sin, wickedness, Antichrist, and all that his darkness has produced in history is dumped into the lake of fire. So we are now in a new approach to spiritual warfare. And as I was describing just this most recent time of ministry, I was doing spiritual warfare with a kingdom culture in mind. And that's what's unique. That I was operating a bit differently from previous spiritual warfare models. I was introducing the tactical approach to spiritual warfare available in the New Era Reformation. Now, I did not do this as a polemic being a refutation of other people. I'm here to argue or criticize what was done in the past. I did it and joined into it and was part of the maturing of the restoration. So I'm not here to create a tactical manual based on what not to do. I'm certain that I'll mention that during this time, and I'll point out things we did that were incomplete or things that we did that we now would do a bit differently. But I'm not writing a polemic, nor am I speaking a polemic, nor did I spend time saying, now, I'm going to do this, and those that did something else were wrong. Nothing wrong with correcting, but it's not my intention. I don't have a mind to diminish the previously legitimate spiritual warfare efforts of kingdom leaders. I did what I did now because original intentions, God's original intentions, are now the first order of business in undoing what hell was done and usurping the usurpers. So a new tactical manual is not a repudiation of previous spiritual warfare models. It is rather an update of spiritual warfare as we enter the new era Reformation. We move from restoration of things that were lost, now fully regained. We move from restoration, not that everything's been restored, but those things that have been restored have prepared us for a new era Reformation. It's already begun, and we're in its infant stages, its infant steps. But we are in it fully enough that it is affecting and should affect the way in which we do spiritual business in our representing of Jesus. So both individual deliverance, which we do, of course, and we teach here at Kingdom Leadership Institute as Freedom Ministry. In fact, we're having a level 1 right now with a room full of people who are ready to receive. So both individual deliverance and regional warfare, or what we call territorial warfare, which can be broader than regional, have a new perspective because we're in the new era. And it is very important that we understand what this means. And the remarkable difference is not a slight upgrade, but is rather a sweeping reform. It's not just better, it's different. So we begin with this important premise of spiritual warfare, that we positively press for God's purposes. And that becomes our priority, our first order of business. We don't begin with anything other than a blueprint. Rather than identify the evil of a region or discern the evil in a person, we begin with the region's purpose and the person's destiny. Now, let me just say, although it's not my notes, this is the fathering aspect of kingdom, and it's the spirit of fathering which is available in the New Era Reformation. We saw this, and I've seen it for 20 years and written many books about it and practiced it, and now I am a father of fathers. But as we reach the New Era Reformation and Reset 2020, Dutch Sheets convening in Middletown, Ohio, and in doing so, he brought 4 basic premises to the forefront, and the fourth one on that Saturday morning was about leadership in the spirit of fathering spirit, and the anointing of that was so strong because it set the tone of the New Era Reformation, that kingdom leadership as a new spirit of leadership, and it is fathering in nature. So the new tactical manual, let me be really clear. And the new strategic way in which we respond is that we begin with a revelation of God's blueprint to read God's battle plan. That we have a battle plan, but it comes through the same people. The battle plan comes from those who have the blueprint. And this shouldn't surprise us. It seems completely obvious, but it's also going to be an upgrade of significance. And as we submit to this new tactical approach and strategy, we will experience even greater breakthroughs. So we will start with an expertise in original intention more than or instead of an expertise in usurping darkness. So for a long time, I've made it clear that becoming an expert in evil is not your preparation for spiritual warfare. And it never has been. And God doesn't want us to be experts in evil. He wants us to have expertise and experience in doing good and being the kind of people that meet God's expectations and fulfill his anticipations, law and prophets, and that we overcome evil with good. But in doing so, we represent Jesus and his restoration, his redemption and restoration of God's original intentions. And we'll get into that more deeply, chapter 1, session 1. Defining spiritual warfare in the new era is based on this idea that we have a recognition, we discern and discover what it is God had intended for a people and a place, both individual people and groups of people, and a culture or nation, region that dwells in an identifiable place that has boundaries. And so remember that God is the one who sets the boundaries of nations, and that the identifiable boundaries of nations are divine in their origins, and this is what God wants, and he doesn't want those boundaries to be erased or removed. When we define spiritual warfare, or waging war in the spirit, spiritual authority and power against spiritual conditions that are produced by spiritual beings, that is, demons produce spiritual conditions, so do we. We don't see a battle between God and the devil. There is none. We don't see a battle between Jesus and the devil. There is none. We do see evidence of spiritual battle of which we are unaware, nor do we participate, between angels and demons. We're not participating in that, but we're players. We're the more important aspects. We're the greater, the players in producing the conflict or escalating the conflict, even creating the conflict by our prayers and by our obedience, which is why we pray. So we probably should start with an understanding that our faith has consequences. We begin to share spiritual experiences with God so that we share his passion. And therefore, on the basis of trusting faith produces shared passion produces submission, and ever deepening level of submission that comes through our surrender, so that we have even greater levels of fullness of obedience. And in doing so, our obedience runs us into opposition. So as we understand spiritual warfare from God's point of view, we understand that we war and we win. So I even have a t-shirt with that on it now, thanks to my good friends, Tom and Diane Morgan, because that's one of those classic statements I love to continually say. We war and we win. We don't win if we don't war. We have a fighting chance, as Oswald Chambers said. Spiritual warfare, I know, brings up the subject, and perhaps you're still waiting for me to discuss the heavenlies and first, second, third heavens, and second heaven warfare, and Satan and witchcraft and demons, and of course temptation, testing. You're looking for a discussion right now of oppression, and I'm not mentioning any of those things because I'm introducing spiritual warfare, and we don't begin with the devil. We begin with the Redeemer. And actually, we will begin with the Father, and we begin with his blueprint and his battle plan, because all of that was shaped and formed before the very foundation of the world. So it is true that we're going to talk about the heavenlies, and we're going to talk about Satan and witchcraft and demons and temptation and idols and boogers here and boogers there. And we're going to discuss demonstrations and manifestations of evil, and in terms of its influence and impact upon individual people and societies as a whole. We're going to talk about pathologies and cultures. But I'm introducing spiritual warfare, and I'm doing so by bringing us back to the New Era Reformation, to an emphasis and a first order strategy, which means that just knowing what God's enemies are killing, stealing, and destroying should rather be a key in warfare of discerning what it is they're after, what it is motivating, or what is the targeting, because the goal of combat is not destruction. That's the goal of the enemy. The goal of our combat is restoration. And when we begin to discuss restoration, we must know what is being restored and how will we recognize its restoration. I like to just say, I go into a region, and if I were to ask the leaders of that region, what does your region look like if it were fully restored? And all the influences of ancient things, of darkness, removed, or at least their influence so diminished that the dominant spiritual influence of your region was producing something of a demonstration of God's original intention. What would your region look like if it were restored? And this is why our new tactical manual is very, very important, because our territorial warfare and our research and our spiritual mapping has not really been focused on God's blueprint as much as it's been focused on the enemy's usurpation and understanding the enemy. And if that's the totality of what we do, we will fail to represent Jesus. And we'll fail to understand what's going on in the spirit, how things really work in the spirit, if all we look at is we're going to overcome evil. There's a reason why we're overcomers. And it's not because it's evil. It's because we represent Jesus in the restoration of his original intentions. And those original intentions come from the Father. So we know that God's enemies, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and to destroy. We know that, and we know the intentions of the enemy, but we need to understand the enemy doesn't kill everything, doesn't steal everything, and doesn't destroy everything. He's strategic in his methodology, and we're not ignorant of it. And so we don't begin with the enemy, we begin with God's purpose. So I can illustrate this, not in a way to diminish or a polemic sense, but we have in the past done battle without a battle plan. And we cannot afford to do that any longer. And I would say that even now, I've never seen a moment when it was more strategic that we find God's generals, we find the remnant, and join it by coming into alignment and agreement with the generals that God is setting in place in this time, which are not the same as the ones we've had before, I might add, because we're looking for generals who have blueprints and battle plans. And previously, I know we invested a great deal of energy in territorial warfare that failed to produce measurable results. I mean, I consider how great people did some great things, while failing to consider the great things they were doing. They were failing to consider the most fundamental issues of a spiritual and kingdom confrontation, in that we were doing territorial warfare, or site preparation is another way to look at it, without a blueprint. You see, when someone intends to build a building on a piece of land, the land has an assumed purpose. I mean, any piece of land has a purpose. What is this? Is this going to be used for farming? Is this going to become a vineyard? Is this going to become a forest? Is this going to become a residential place, a horse ranch? Is this a mine? So we want to know the assumed purpose of the land, and know then that the buildings that are built on it will match that purpose or add to the fulfillment of that purpose and answer back to that purpose. So we know that spiritually speaking, if we're going to do construction, we need to lay a strong foundation, and immediately we come to do anything that has kingdom authority and power that then claims the claim of Jesus. We're going to run right into the usurper. We're going to run into the previous influence that has been established, and that previous influence of evil will not be welcoming what we're doing. So we need the blueprints for the land's purpose and the buildings constructed upon the land. And we call those blueprints. That set of blueprints will include site preparation. And that site preparation plan will then consider what's under the soil, contour, drainage of the ground, and proper placement or the preparation of the ground, the land itself, for the buildings and the building sites. and in fact will appropriately place the buildings for line of sight and also for functionality. No one would consider doing site preparation on the land without a good grasp of its purpose. And no plan of action would begin with what is without a grasp of what it will be when it's finished. I would suppose Jesus meant if you build on the sand instead of the rock, then you would certainly anticipate that the purpose of the building would not ever reach its ultimate. So for many years, we did territorial warfare like an all-out attack on prevailing spiritual conditions with little thought or without a vision of the end product. We didn't start with what's God's intended purpose for the people in place. We savaged the sites and walked away feeling good about our spiritual scorched earth approach to warfare. And turning the devil around seemed to be the end goal of our spiritual warfare. And the teams were often composed of people who had no mind or vision to build on the desert they left behind. Uproot everything and level out everything and break every boulder into pieces. And yet substrata, there were things of indication necessary to be touched. We needed to go to substrata in our preparations. But often we thought the perception that we busted the devil real good was the measurement of our success. And of course, they were good people, and they were able to, kick some devil hiney, and however you want to put it. I have some other words along those lines. And of course, we can do that. But that's not our goal, is just to show that we're stronger than demons. Our goal, not only, it's not even removing demonic strongholds, so the result will be revival. It's not even, wow, we're going to come in and take dominion and show who's boss. It's not that. Spiritual warfare, you see, was very focused upon the history of demonic manifestations and the overthrow of their present day influences. And so I've observed people, it's like, that demon died, and an immediate response of celebration when the devil's defeated. And then someone says, now we're going to establish, and we're going to expand and enforce the kingdom. So let's get the building. And everybody's like, oh yeah, well, we're ready for the next conflict with the enemy. So I have people motivated who spend thousands of dollars and give hundreds of hours to warfare, who will not fund the foundation or submit themselves to the establishing, and aren't there for the structures of kingdom culture and of apostolic order. So I'm not here to offer criticism, only to point out that we now add something that has been missing, something that to a large extent, something missing from the nature, design, and composition of our prayer movements and our warfare conferences. And having a restoration of appropriate kingdom leadership, apostolic order, kingdom leadership dynamics, and all the 5 aspects of the leadership of Jesus, and engaging in some form of kingdom establishing, apostolic restoration, gave Christ's enemies a healthy shaking. The devil knows we're here now. We have apostolic restoration. But to see something even more remarkable, we must mature that restoration warfare into Reformation warfare as the restoration itself matures into Reformation. To some extent, we continue to celebrate those previous efforts, and to some extent, we recognize the limitation of these efforts. To no extent do we criticize them when they are valid and authentic. I mean, there's a lot of fruits and nuts in the history of deliverance and the history of warfare that we do ignore. But there has been this tremendous river cutting through solid rock for decades that has brought us to this moment that we honor. So I offered one example of how territorial warfare often failed to entertain the ultimate goal of God. I could mention how personal warfare at the level of individual freedom, what we come to call deliverance, might have suffered from malpractice during the same period of time. I can see how territorial warfare did some things, but left a whole bunch of things undone. And how deliverance just got a bad name, and should have in a lot of cases, because people didn't understand how things really work in the spirit, or failed to follow apostolic order in all these kingdom functions. So, in Freedom Ministry, and we've ministered to about 300,000 people in the nations. We help leaders understand that dealing with demons is not the goal of any spiritual warfare at any level. We're going to deal with them, but that's not our goal. That's not the focus. That's not our expertise. We're not experts with demons. We're experts with purpose and destiny. And dealing with demons at any level is but a means to an end and not the end itself. Remember that if hell cannot keep you from spiritual warfare, hell will work consistently and constantly to limit the power and effectiveness of spiritual warfare by distracting you from God's purpose to some other secondary goal. The anything but that method will be what you also will overcome. So I'm going to stop there in this first introductory session and give ourselves some time to assimilate. But we're going to, this is about 38 minutes here into the first session of introduction, and I'll come back and finish. And by this time, this, of course, you're watching as pre-recorded, but the second half of introduction will be live and will take some interactive time as we continue on the Zoom call. So those of you joining us for a new tactical manual for spiritual warfare here at Kingdom Leadership Institute, you can go to www.klitraining.com, www.KLI, Kingdom Leadership Institute, klitraining.com. Become a student. We apply for $25. I'll personally do your personal placement, and then you'll be enrolled for $100, your lifetime enrollment fee. In other words, that will place you, and then you'll have access to all the teachings that I have done and others have done, and the continually growing and updated curriculum of this Kingdom Leadership Institute, and its purpose to produce in this time of new era Reformation the kind of kingdom leader who is ready to lead in this time of history. So I'll be back. I'm Dr. Don Lynch.